Looking for that great next read or your new favorite author? Check out Amy's Bookshelf Reviews recommendations. You won't be disappointed. Welcome to Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast. It is a spin-off of the website and book review site of Amy's Bookshelf Reviews. Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast is about book reviews, a writer's muse, a book's peruse, author interviews, and literary news. Welcome to the new year, where new things may happen with this. I hope you all enjoy, and thank you for listening.
Good evening, listeners. I'm Amy, and welcome to Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast. Today, we are joined by an author. Please introduce yourself and let the audience know how they can connect with you.
I'm Kay Smith-Blum. I'm a debut author, but I have a robust website with lots of information about my debut novel, Tangles. The website is K-A-Y, Smith hyphen or dash Blum, B-L-U-M, at .com, right? And sorry, I kind of stumbled over that. I'm used to giving people my email, but you can find that too on my website if you want to reach out directly. And I look forward to hearing from any and all readers.
Well, that's really great. I mean, this is your debut novel, so it must be very exciting for you.
It is, and this novel happened in a rather unexpected manner because I was knee-deep querying my second manuscript, and suddenly I got the germ of an idea about this, and it almost wrote itself.
Oh, I love that. I love it. You kind of let the storyline and the characters kind of write it for you, basically.
Yeah, and some of these characters, got out of control a little bit. Okay. There were certain points where I thought, wait, is she really going to do that? And sure enough.
Those are the best kind of characters when they step out of character. So,
exactly.
When did you really start writing?
So I was a fashionista. I worked for Neiman Marcus before I married my husband, and he had opened the first European menswear store in Seattle during the time that I was a buyer for Neiman's. And when we decided to get married, he owned his store, and I didn't own Neiman Marcus. So I moved to Seattle, and we opened women's inside of the men's store as well, and that immediately took off. And so we had a wonderful almost 4-decade run in the downtown core of Seattle, and miraculously from a timing standpoint and just in general in the industry, we were able to sell our specialty store in 2016. And when that happened, I had been threatening to write my birth mother's story because I had found my birth family in the mid-90s and discovered that my birth mother, the story around why she gave me away, how she gave me away, and what happened after that was really quite the tale, and including the fact that she went to work for the mob. And so when we sold the store, I set about to write that story. And the research and kind of the road to that story took a lot longer than I ever thought it would, because there were so many twists and turns in her story. And at the end of the day, I just felt like I wasn't getting it right. And like what so often happens when an author is researching one story, they find ideas for more.
Yeah.
And I had stumbled upon in my research of women in Texas, because I was born and raised in Austin, Texas. My birth mother gave me up in Austin, Texas. I discovered that there had been an all-female state Supreme Court appointed in 1925. And I was just fascinated by that. And so I set aside my birth mother story and started researching these iconic women judges and developed an entire novel around one particular judge, the one who lived the longest. And it, entirely fictitious, of course, but I imagined her response to the civil rights movement, being a glass ceiling breaker herself in the 20s and being a suffragette. So that was a really great tale. And I was getting some real good responses from agents, etc. And then I had a very serious conversation with an agent about that particular manuscript. And she convinced me that it was not the right one to be my debut, that it could be possibly my second novel, but for a variety of reasons. But probably shouldn't be my debut. And she said, "What else have you got?" And I literally had nothing else, but I had this germ of an idea about tangles from a dream that I had had. So I said, "Can I get back to you in about 8 or 9 months?" And she said, "Sure."
Wow.
And so down the research rabbit hole I went again, because I'd had this odd dream about red hair floating on a body of water. And it had become more defined because the dream recurred. Mm-hmm. And then randomly ran into two different folks who were both born and raised in the Tri-Cities, which is the metropolitan area that is adjacent to the Hanford nuclear plant. And Richland, one of the Tri-Cities, there are three cities, Kennewick, Pasco, and Richland. Richland was actually the company built town for the Hanford nuclear plant. It was built in a span of a year. And the original population was about 5,000. They were all workers at the Hanford plant during World War II and beyond. And Hanford's and Richland's population during the Cold War swelled to about 25,000. And the rest is history, because the Cold War is what really put Hanford on the map, so to speak. They went from 2 nuclear reactors to 11. And you can imagine the amount of nuclear waste that was created.
Can't imagine. Yeah, I know. It's probably something you couldn't even put your finger on.
Well, actually, they have. It's
really?
56 million gallons. 56 million gallons of radioactive waste is stored in these huge concrete waste tanks on the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. The reservation is about 320,000 acres. And unfortunately, some of the tanks are leaking because, as you can imagine, radioactive waste, think acid, think all kinds of things that can kind of dig through other elements and respond differently to one another inside the tanks, creating other reactions, not the least of which is hydrogen. So it's a critical situation there, and it's one that's been in the news quite a bit lately because the workforce has been reduced. And some folks say reduce in a manner that perhaps is creating some dangerous situations. So Tangles has great relevance today because it shows the reader in a very fast-paced, palatable way, how we got here.
Yeah. I mean, I read this book, obviously, and I gave it 5 stars, and it was amazing. And I loved the story, and I knew that, this happens. I remember, well, not all of the Cold War, but part of it, and when, some people don't even, like kids now or generations now, they're like, what the heck's a Cold War, and they don't really quite understand what it is, because all they know what, war is it's killing people. The Cold War just gave us that fear that we were all going to just perish because of nuclear war. I mean, like we talked before, the show, that Um, the sirens would go off and we'd hide under our desks, and our teachers were like, and we're just thinking we're going to kiss our butt goodbye. And then it's over with, and then you're like, wait a minute, should I even look out the window? Is there going to be like a big old mushroom cloud out there? So
Exactly. I
and
know it was a very scary time. I did those same desk drills, right? But you're so right. I did a book signing at Barnes and Noble. I'm in Palm Desert, California right now, and I did a book signing at Barnes and Noble last Friday, and I was so thrilled every time somebody under the age of 30 bought my book, and I actually had, I'd say at least half the books I sold were to younger generation folks, because it's a time period that really is not taught in our history classes. And even if you grew up in Washington State, the history books, textbooks tend to not get rewritten that often. And that's something I would love to see modernized somehow in our educational system, so that all of this very important history of the recent past is recorded and folks learn about it, because these are lessons in kind of the mechanisms of conflict, global conflict, specifically in terms of the Cold War, that are so important for people to understand what causes two different countries to become enemies and how does that happen. And I think that my tale broaches that subject. I try to use my characters, particularly Mary, who is one of the narrators, and her boss, Harry, and their conversations about what's happening now in the political climate during 1947 to 1951. And then same thing with Luke, the other narrator, and his pal, Walker, who's an indigenous biologist that's employed by the state of Washington. They are conversing about the move to end the Cold War, the move to end above ground testing of nuclear devices. And so in conversations in very palatable ways, the reader learns what that time period was all about and what the issues were and how various people felt about those issues. And I think that's such a critical piece of information for folks today to have.
I agree. I mean, when you read it and you're like whatever's going on now, and this is still, it's 70, 80 years later, and we still have nuclear plants.
Exactly.
Where I live in upstate New York, and I know of two that are within 100 miles of where I live. And you just wonder what could happen. We don't know what their security is. And even like he said, with the various chemicals and things like that. And sometimes there's illegal chemical dumping, and that's not just in the movies. It actually happens. And so I think that this book, it not only tells you the story and paints the picture, but it's also people who don't know about it or don't even understand the concepts of it. If they read this book, I think it gives them information, so they're learning about it without even realize that, oh, I'm learning something.
Right. I'm so happy to hear you say that, because that was my goal. I wrote and rewrote so many scenes so that they wouldn't be, science heavy or technically laden.
Yeah.
And I was so fortunate to have so many different experts, nuclear physicists, nuclear health physicists, nuclear engineers, historians, et cetera, that helped vet a lot of the manuscript and make sure that when I was attempting to put something that was pretty sciencey into the narrative, that I did it in a layman friendly way. So it isn't like you have to constantly be Googling terms or anything like that to really understand what's happening in the story. But you do come away with an understanding of how a nuclear reactor works and what plutonium is and how combustible various radioactive isotopes are and what a half-life is of a radioactive isotope, which is really critical in our discussions about the environment because radioactive isotopes don't go away. They last for thousands and thousands, if not millions of years.
Right.
Which is why the waste is such a problem and has to be handled in such a ginger way. And I've had, it's so interesting, Amy, I've had folks that have said to me, well, we didn't have a Manhattan Project site in our state. And I'll say, but you have 2 nuclear reactors in your state. Nuclear reactors require splitting of the atom, require an atomic reaction. And every time radioactive isotopes are responding to one another, byproducts, off gases are created. That is nuclear waste.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter if you're generating nuclear power, if you're generating a nuclear reaction to create electricity or other types of power, nuclear waste is created. And so, the narrative that's out there about nuclear energy being green, nothing could be further from the truth, because not only does it create nuclear waste, but this is waste that we have no idea how to deal with.
That's true. And sometimes it's not like if you opened it and looked at it, it may not be visibly to you to say, oh yeah, that's dangerous,
right.
And knowing what it is, and say somebody was dumping that, or it was leaking into your groundwater, or your and then spreading,
right.
know, and
right.
That's what happens, and
that's what happens, and that's what happened in Eastern Washington. It also happened along the Savannah River where the other plutonium plant was, Oak Ridge, during the Manhattan Project. These 2 plants, Hanford and Oak Ridge, produced all of the plutonium for every bomb that's in the U.S. arsenal. And the production created, as I said before, millions of gallons of nuclear waste. But in Oak Ridge's case, it completely destroyed the Savannah River. It is still a very dangerous situation there and is a Superfund site. Hanford is triple the problem. It is 3 Superfund sites. And these cleanups are not just arduous, but proving on many levels to be almost impossible to completely solve or completely clean up.
Yeah. And it's not like when you pour gasoline or oil where it settles on top of the water where you can see it,
right.
It's
insidious, right?
Yeah.
It leaks into everything. And, unless you're doing serious scientific testing, you don't necessarily know that the ground or the soil is irradiated, et cetera. So it really is a problem. When I was doing a couple of book events in Park City, Utah, it was during the course of the last few days of the Sundance Festival. And I was privileged to watch Middletown, which is about it's a documentary that was created about a group of high school kids that through their journalism class, they started experimenting with video cameras and centered on a toxic waste dump, the town dump outside of Middletown, which is in upstate New York. They uncovered the fact that much of the waste was toxic, and part of the waste was radioactive nuclear waste that had been trucked from a nuclear plant to be dumped in their town dump. And the barrels that it was in were leaking.
Oh, geez. Wow.
So that's another great documentary. Watch for it. It's making the rounds of film festivals now, but Middletown.
I will definitely do that. I live in upstate New York, so.
Oh my gosh. Okay then.
I do know where that town is. So do you have an excerpt you'd like to read for us?
I think it's always great for folks to hear the very first scene with Luke.
Okay.
As I said, this is a dual narrative. And so the prologue is Mary, my female narrator in the late 40s, and she disappears in 1951. But Luke was an adolescent when Mary was a secretary at the Hanford plant and lived next door to her in one of the company built duplexes. So Mary starts off by setting the scene in the prologue that's very quick. And then the reader rolls right into chapter 1 with Luke, who is now grown and pursuing his doctorate in science. So this is September 13th, 1963. Industrial chains stretched off a rusted metal winch to 8 points of the whale. The torso overwhelmed the flatbed trailer parked outside the waterway, the back and belly ripped where the harpoon's barb had struck, not once, but 3 times. According to the boat crew, the fin whale had been slow in the sea compared to the rest of the pod, but not an easy mark. A bomb lance had torn her open, and the inner flesh glistened in an otherworldly sheen. Ready to serve up blessings, a dozen members of the Tututni tribe dotted the narrow bank, bordering the strip of the Skipanon River that fed into the coastal Oregon marina. The hive of activity on the dock area invited curious seagulls, their flybys skirting our heads as we unloaded. An on-site test of the whale's blood had triggered my summons. Teddy, as in Theodore Roosevelt Walker, a state-employed biologist and an informal partner in my doctoral research, had called me, saying I should see the catch before bioharvest took over. The tribes were the real stewards in the region, and Walker, a mix of Yakima and Wanapum, was pulled into environmental tussles more often than not. Luke, Walker said, extending his hand. Walker. The nickname Teddy had never seemed to fit the man. Could someone jar up water samples from the mouth of the bay for us? Walker side-eyed the scene, among other things. Much appreciated. I nodded and turned to the whale, the stench permeating my protective gear. My lab mate, Roy, his freckled face obscured behind his mask, scooped out part of the stomach contents, mostly krill. We bagged and bucketed everything into a series of coolers, the product of our work lining the dock like a clam dig haul. Tribal chants started up, a steady, low-pitched cadence. I swished whale's blood in a test tube with a solution from our portable kit to check for zinc. Zinc had been prevalent in the production process near my hometown, among other elements strong enough to kill a whale and sure to kill a human, which had been the point. The sole reason Richland, Washington had been built and why I had left when my father died. Bombs never kill, just the enemy. Across the inlet, the lumber yard split up sawdust like wedding rice. Wishing away the sore throat that I had coming on, I raised the vial to the midday sun. A potpourri of problematic activity, I said. If the whole pod fed on this plankton, we could use the hot zinc to trace their route. Roy said this with a grin, not having lived where I had. Walker had mentioned that the whale was pregnant when he called. Where's the calf? Walker giant stepped over acacia buoys and drew back the flap of a smaller tarp. The cow damaged the whaler's boat pretty good, he laughed. The sun's glare obscured my vision, but the fierceness of expectant mothers made me smile. I blinked into focus, and a sick sensation invaded my belly. Roy peered over my shoulder. About halfway through gestation, don't you think? Maybe 6 months? This far along, it should have fins. And it didn't. Just 2 stubs and eyeless sockets that flanked both sides of the snout. Black, vacuous tunnels that bored into my memory banks. The chanting rose in volume, drowning out my moan. I'd returned home for the holidays after vagabonding around Europe a couple of years ago, needing a job before starting my doctoral program. My mother had suggested the Johnsons might want help at their ranch outside Altopia during the lambing season. A shotgun blast had woken me from my bunk in the dark morning hours. I'd found Mr. Johnson in the barn, kneeling in blood-soaked hay next to a dead ewe. Said her insides were completely broken after birthing. As he spoke, he held a lamb under water in one of those large tin tubs. The legs of the newborn were fused, like someone had bound them with an invisible ribbon for Christmas. Mr. Johnson had already dealt with the other. Belly up at the far end of the tub, it had 4 stubs for legs and black holes on either side of its cherubic snout. The Johnsons lost 40 ewes and 73 lambs that season. I had helped deliver them all to the tub.
Wow. I mean, I read it, but still, when you read it, that is amazing. And if that's not enough to make our listeners pick up your book, I don't know what else would do it. I'm serious. That is so amazing. And I love when I have authors on and they read their book, because it's like it comes back to me. I mean, I read hundreds a year, but it, and there's something about when an author reads their own work, you have that passion. And that's something that I could see in your writing as I read. So I am so glad that I had you on the show. You're a pretty amazing writer, and I hope that you continue to write and share your work with me. That first book you were talking about, if you ever get that going, I would love to read that one as well.
Thank you. I'm actually deep into redrafting the beginning of my second manuscript, the one about the iconic female judge.
Yeah.
And that's going pretty well. But I'm big on debunking the tropes of the mid 20th century. And one of the things I really think is so important is for the younger generation to read these so that they understand how recent, certain rights for women, along with other groups, those are very recent and very precious. Exactly. So I look forward to more conversations, Amy. I really appreciate you having me.
Oh, thank you very much. So if you wish for you or your book to be on the show, go to amysbookshelfreviews.com/podcast. Thank you for listening. Be safe, be well, and as always, be kind.
Thank you for listening to Amy's Bookshelf Reviews. If you are looking to be on the podcast or looking for a book review, you can go to amysbookshelfreviews.com and look for the appropriate navigational menu. Again, thank you all for listening and being a supporter of this podcast and of the Amy's Bookshelf Reviews professional reviewers of books and audiobooks. Thank you all. Be safe and be well.